Good afternoon, good evening. A huge welcome to the second of our 775 talks showcasing our amazing academics here at Univ. And of course, showcasing their work. And I'm absolutely delighted that our speaker this evening is Dr. Natalya Vince, whose subject title this evening is Turn On, Tune In, Don't Drop Out. 1960s students between protest and state building. An incredible era to talk about. Dr. Natalya Vince is Univ's Sanderson Tutorial Fellow in Modern History, and her research focuses on the French Empire, decolonization, and post-colonial histories in the 20th and 21st centuries. And one of the key themes running through her research is how ordinary people shape as well as resist seismic political events and social and cultural shifts. Natalya will speak to us for about 20-25 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes. Please, throughout the talk, if you have questions, please put them in the chat Q&A box, and I will try and group as many of them as I can so we can get through as many of them as we can. Natalya, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thank you all for being here this evening. Some of you actually might have been students in the 1960s. All of you, I think, will be familiar with some of the iconic imagery which it produced. So here are just sort of a handful of images of students participating in the demonstrations and occupations of what is sometimes referred to by shorthand as May 68. More accurately, this is a decade of contesting imperialism abroad, and you'll notice a lot of references to Vietnam in this imagery, and stultifying social norms at home. One of the cliches about how May 68 started in France is that the boys wanted to go into the girls' dormitories. It started as a dispute about sex segregation in the halls of residence. These student movements could be found in East and West, in the global North and in the global South. And in the middle, I've put a poster, as you can see, it's a French poster, produced by the Atelier Populaire, which were sort of the striking art students in Paris in 1968, who produced this very sort of iconic imagery. And I wanted to flag that to you now, because this kind of imagery is going to come back at a number of points in the talk this evening. So there's been a big shift by historians in recent years to study these student movements in a connected way. And this is part of what is called the global turn in history. So a global history of the long 1960s aims to challenge what global historians call methodological nationalism. That is to say, assuming that the nation state, so countries such as France or Algeria or Nigeria, are natural units of analysis to study politics, economy, society, and culture. Global historians of the long 1960s are instead interested in transnational connections above and below the level of the nation state, so exchanges of ideas, mobility of people, and so on and so forth, and what are sometimes termed transnational imaginaries. Transnational imaginaries are less materially grounded. In this context, it sort of refers to the idea that you understand your struggles as part of a global struggle, and you have a sense of solidarity with people who might be very far away from you geographically. This sense of connection might be because you're campaigning on the same issues, such as Vietnam, or because you see those issues as connected to a global system of domination. So connections are made, for example, between the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the civil rights movements led by African Americans in the United States. So 1960 student protests are hugely attractive to global historians as an object of study, because they lend themselves quite easily to this approach. The student protests all over the world, all around the same time, and the slogans regularly refer to international events. You will notice the face of Che Guevara in the picture of Italian students demonstrating there. However, one of the risks, I think, of going too global is losing a sense of the local struggles and political cultures in which these conflicts are grounded. It's also pretty hard to get rid of the nation state as a frame of analysis in the 1960s, despite the Pan-African and Pan-Asian sort of federalist dreams of anti-colonialists in the interwar and immediate post-Second World War period. By the late 1950s, everybody wants a nation state. It comes to be seen as the means to achieve freedom and equality. The UN, created in 1945, was the consecration of the nation-state system. And in 1960, sometimes termed the Year of Africa, 17 African countries become independent and all immediately become members of the United Nations. A second potential limitation, I think, of going global is if we take Western European and North America as our starting point, we sort of assume that students in Africa and Asia, and indeed in the Eastern Bloc, are swept along in what is often framed as primarily sort of a generational conflict, reacting against the authoritarian tendencies of liberal democracies and the model of consumerist-based growth of the post-Second World War generation. Perhaps no one embodied this generational conflict more than the French president, Charles de Gaulle, who, when the May 68 protests broke out in France, he was 71 years old, and he's sort of accused of silencing young people and also failing to move over and make political space for a younger generation. Although indeed, looking at the poster on the right, demanding retirement age 60, some of us might quite like that idea too. But what I'm arguing is that this idea of generational conflict doesn't really work to understand what's going on in the decolonizing world. In Africa and Asia, post-colonial elites are younger, if not always young, but they're also, more importantly, at this stage, very new in terms of their length of time in power. So this is a period of uncertainty, of finding one's feet about what form the post-colonial state will take. And I want to underline decolonization as sort of a messy, ongoing process, which is connected to, but cannot be reduced to, the moment of the transfer of sovereignty, what is sometimes called flag independence. So students in the decolonizing world are both challenging the post-colonial settlement, which marks flag independence, i.e. the leaders who come to power and the systems that they're functioning in and building. And at the same time, these students want to be part of state building, which is understood in this context as having an educated population, providing access to healthcare, having a technologically advanced infrastructure and industry. So I'm interested in what it means to contest the state, but also be a key actor in state building. And you might say to me, well, Natalya, doesn't Oxbridge do this? It produces sort of politicians and civil servants and leaders of industry. And so whatever radical politics they might have been involved in at university, at some point they become, most of them, part of the establishment. And depending on one's perspective, you might consider they sort of grow up or they sell out. But what I'm arguing is that this is a very different situation. These students in the immediate post-war context are strikingly different from students in Western European and Northern American universities. So the first thing to underline is that there's so few of them. So in 1962, there's about 165,000 students enrolled in higher education in Africa and abroad. This is an absolutely tiny percentage of the overall population. There's not even one university per country in Africa upon independence. Of those that exist, many of them are very, very new. So universities in Nigeria and Ghana and Uganda are only created by the British colonial state in 1948. And where there are universities, often they're in places where there has been sort of white minority rule. And this is just a picture of the library of the University of Algiers in 1962, which members of the settler population set fire to upon leaving Algeria in 1962, burning or damaging 500,000 books in the process. And the fact that there's so few students is also a reflection of literacy rates. So just to give you a sense of literacy rates, here's some statistics from UNESCO in 1957. The generation of African university students I'm talking about are not only the first in their families to go to university, they're often the first in their family to go to school. So this is not, as in Western Europe, a gradual process of opening up higher education to women and the working class. Rather, this is a period of very significant, sort of almost dizzying social mobility as primary, secondary, and higher education expand rapidly. Finally, these students are needed to work in the state administration and infrastructure now. So this is, again, not a story in which you join the civil service fast stream and gradually work your way up. Many students in this period already have a job, or indeed a number of jobs, and some of them in their late 20s or early 30s are already, running heavy industry or head of the National Bank. And I just want to pause for a moment on what the consequences are of having a very recent student population, of whom many already have jobs in the state administration and infrastructure alongside a very young local staff. So to stick with our example of Algeria, special sessions and special exams are established for those with gaps in their secondary and university education to enable them to catch up. Evening classes are organised to allow those who are busy in their full-time jobs to come and study at university to obtain the qualification necessary for the post that they actually already occupy, either in the police or the judiciary or in the government. It has to be said that actually most staff are not African in Africa in this period. They're European, they're American, they're Soviet. In Arabic-speaking countries, they often come from the Middle East. But where these sort of evening class students, if you like, that already have jobs are taught by Algerians, they're actually often being taught by teachers who are younger than them. So, for example, the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Algiers, the first Algerian Dean of the Faculty of Law, was only 33 when he became Dean of the Faculty of Law. And this can create some really quite interesting situations. So in 1962, the dean, his name's Ahmed Mahiou, he was running the oral exams for administrative law, and a student turned up, showed his student card to prove his identity for the viva, and Ahmed Mahiou realized that he had in front of him the director of the Algerian Sécurité Militaire, which is actually the highly feared secret police. His name is Kasti Merba. So already he's got opposite him the director of the secret police, who happens to be a student, and then the student has to pick an unseen question at random. And rather unfortunately for the dean, Kasti Merba randomly picks the question, the limits to police powers. So one can only imagine a very awkward moment. Mahiou tries to suggest that maybe he'd like to pick another question, but the head of the secret police very politely says to him, Monsieur le Professeur, I've pulled out just one question, and so I'm going to answer this question. And thus ensued a very sort of surreal scene in which the director of the secret police described the theoretical limits to his power, which in reality were largely unchecked. The shortage of students also means that there's intense competition between different government ministries to recruit students. They are literally fighting over students. And on completing their studies, students who graduate are very easily walk into a job and change job very easily in this period as well. And it's very easy for them to change course, to get a bursary, to travel abroad, and so on and so forth. And this brings me to the story of one of the first women to go and study in the Soviet Union. She studies geology. Her name is Warda Belanter. She's born in a tiny little village in the region of Boumerdès. Both of her parents are illiterate. Her father's a railway worker. Her father is also a member of the Algerian Communist Party. Warda's education is very interrupted by the fact that there's war going on at the time, the Algerian War of Independence. But nevertheless, the fact that she's had an education means that a whole variety of jobs are sort of open to her when she enters the job market just after independence. Amongst these jobs, she's a secondary school teacher teaching almost every subject, including swimming, even though she can't swim. And she also gets a job at the Ministry for the Interior, even though she's a communist in the country, which has banned the Communist Party. In the late 1960s, however, she's ready for sort of a change of scenery. She wants to return to her education. And this is how she describes getting a bursary to go and study in the Soviet Union. And these are her words. One day, by chance, I was in the office of the Director for Foreign Cooperation, the person in charge of professional development for the Algerian National Mining Company. He came to bring in the applications for students going to Russia. We started talking and he said that there were bursaries. I asked whether I could apply and he said, no, we don't send women. And I said I really wanted to go. And he said, girls, no. Already the boys we're sending to the Soviet Union, we're sending them there and they all end up depressed, they become alcoholic, they're ill all the time. It's too rough, you won't be able to cope. And I begged him, I gave him my application and in the end they accepted it. It was a struggle, but in the end I went. So what emerges from these stories is that because students are such a rare commodity in the post-independent state, they actually have not an insignificant degree of margin of maneuver in terms of their choice of study, employment, political opinions. So why does this matter? I think firstly, it challenges a sort of miserablist view of the post-colonial state in which, you know, colonial elite is replaced by a post-colonial elite, which then continues to repress the wider population in similar ways to the former colonial master. I think the reality is a lot messier, and actually some of the most authoritarian states are often forced to accept a degree of plurality in order to function. Now, of course, that is not to say that the repression of students doesn't exist, because they certainly are repressed, and it is to this that we shall now turn. So to go back to the year of Algerian independence, 1962, what we see in 1962 is the implosion of the Algerian National Liberation Front. This has been a very effective anti-colonial wartime front. As independence becomes closer, a very violent, divisive internal power struggle takes place. And those who take power in summer 1962 are a faction of the National Liberation Front's army. The first president of Algeria is a military man. His name is Ahmed Ben Bella. Now, Ben Bella and his supporters then set about building a single party state, which what they want is they basically want everybody organized into a mass organization. So mass organization for women, one for youth, one for workers, and indeed one for students. So they don't want independent student unions. They want unions under the control of the single party of the National Liberation Front. And one of the groups which resists the most being put under party control are students. And there's a real battle in the first decade of independence for control of the National Union of Algerian Students. Is it going to be an autonomous organization run by students, or is it going to be under the control of the single party state? And nevertheless, at the same time, many students quite like the ideas of Ben Bella. They like his socialism, they like his third worldism, and students are one of the few groups to protest when Ben Bella is overthrown in a coup on the 19th of June 1965 by his former ally, fellow military man Houari Boumediene. And at this point, I'd like to introduce you to Ahmed Ben Yahya, who is an art student and also designed one of independent Algeria's first stamps that you see him holding in a big format there. So 1965, Ahmed Ben Yahya is at the Fine Arts School in Algiers. He's a representative of the student union, and he's describing a demonstration that takes place just before the overthrow of Ben Bella. So these are his words. So as a union representative of the Fine Arts School, I asked the principal to let the students go so we could go to a public meeting of the president. I had the idea to get a skull from the anatomy class, and I took a broomstick handle. I made a kind of cross. I put a black gown on it. Around the skull and cross bones, I put a sign. It said, "Me, Tshombe, lackey of imperialism." And I led the fine arts students, and we went down from up where the fine arts schools was, and we went all the way down through Algiers, picking up students along the way. And when we arrived at the square where Ben Bella was speaking, there were maybe 2,000 or 3,000 of us. And you'll notice in this account his international reference to Tshombe, the president of the secessionist state of Katanga between 1960 and 1963 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Tshombe favors ties with Belgium, the former colonial power, and he plays a role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first president of the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1961. So this demonstration doesn't actually save Ben Bella. As I've said, he's overthrown. Ben Yahya himself is arrested. He's tortured. He's tortured by the Algerian secret police. Under the authority of the man giving his presentation on the limitation of police powers a few years later. And he sort of flees to France, where he actually then goes on to play a role in the French May 68. And because he's an art student, he actually works in the Atelier Populaire, producing these very sort of distinctive artworks. But what is actually quite striking is that many of these students who are arrested and tortured actually refuse to remain in exile. And here I'd like to present to you another student. This is obviously a picture of him when he's a little bit older. And his name is Rachid Sidi Boumediene, no relation to President Boumediene. So during the colonial period, Rachid went to study chemistry in France. He's also an activist in the anti-colonial struggle. And upon his return to Algeria, he teaches at the School of Engineering. And while he's teaching engineering, he's also studying sociology. And during this time in independent Algeria, he is also an elected representative of the Algerian Student Union, so involved in all of those struggles about maintaining its autonomy from the single party state. When Boumediene's coup happens in June, he quickly leaves to France because he basically warns that he's in danger. Military security, Sécurité Militaire, is looking for him. But he actually quite rapidly becomes disillusioned with his life as a student exile. And this is what he says about being a student in Paris in the late 1960s. And it's a more unusual take on things. So, Rachid Sidi Boumediene. When you're in Paris, you're two things. Firstly, you wear black clothes, you let your hair grow long, and you grow a beard. You play the revolutionary. Because when you're an Algerian revolutionary in exile, all doors are open to you. And I knew what these revolutionaries were like very well because I'd frequented them before 1962. And I was hanging around with them now in Paris. I saw them, the communists, the anarchists, the Trotskyists, the Maoists. I knew them all. And I saw the Algerians who spent their time whining, Algeria, when they heard Algerian music. They were homesick, etc. But they were fine. They had girlfriends, they had a good life. They were fine. And I didn't like that. So I avoided hanging around with them. And then one day someone said, hey, Rachid, I'm going to take you to see a friend. His dad was a Spanish Republican and he makes a great paella. And it hit me like that because at that time I'd started to cook couscous for my friends and I had no idea how to cook. It was disgusting. And on the way there to the Spanish friend's house, I had a vision of myself staying in Paris and someone was going to one day say to his friend on his way to my house, we're going to eat couscous with a revolutionary friend. And I said to myself, is that all I have left? I was going to become the couscous revolutionary of Paris. And immediately I considered that it was a question of self-preservation, of survival to return to Algeria. So 18 months after the coup of 1965, Rachid returns to Algeria and he's asked to take over the running of a factory producing domestic gas in Constantine. And this is a terrifying prospect because he's got the technical knowledge, but really no idea about how to run a factory. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of gas involved. It's quite an explosive situation, but you know, he manages to make his way through it. And all during this period, the struggle between students and the Algerian authorities is still ongoing. So this is a pamphlet, a clandestine pamphlet that was produced in March 1968 to demand the liberation of a number of student leaders who'd been arrested following a series of student strikes. This is framed as a struggle for democracy. So one of the pieces of graffiti describes in it makes an equivalence between the heads of the FLN, Qaid Ahmed and Franco. The pamphlet also includes messages of solidarity from around the world, from students in Martinique, Morocco, Sofia, Prague, and also quite interestingly, there's a message from the University of Sheffield as well. One of the things that the students also denounce in this brochure is that on the 1st of February 1968 in Oran, in Western Algeria, the student headquarters is occupied by the police whilst the students have left it to go on a pro-Palestinian demonstration. And this is seen by these students as particularly heinous and backhanded, as all the Algerians are meant to be particularly mobilized at this point in a wave of pan-Arab solidarity following the 1967 Six-Day War. And I'm going to end on 1967. So in June 1967, the Six-Day War takes place between Israel and various Arab states, primarily Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It ends in defeat for the Arab states and further territorial losses for Palestinians. And it creates a shockwave across the Arab world. There's not really the expectation that the Egyptian army is going to collapse so quickly. And this is a moment of political convergence between, in Algeria, the repressive single-party state and the student movements. Because now we have street demonstrations of students who are not just protesting against the government, but also now in support of the Algerian government and Algeria's international position. This is sort of a moment of sort of pan-Arab solidarity. At the same time as the sneaky example of the police occupying student headquarters in Oran implies, we also need to think about the way in which 1967 becomes part of Algerian domestic politics. So after 1967, university students in Algeria have to do military service for the first time. Previously, they were exempted because their education was seen as more important than doing military service. From now on, they all have to do it. And for a brief moment, women are also, female students in particular, are also mobilized to do military service. And this is some images, a lot of this is sort of quite symbolic, but here are some images of sort of women marching in 1967. Our military service is also used to punish students. So here we see Farouk Mohammed Brahim. These are some of his sort of family photos. In the photo on the left at the bottom, he's one of the men with the stethoscope, so you'll be able to tell he's a medical student. And he's also one of the key figures in student protests in sort of 67, 68, and he's sort of arrested and tortured. And one of the ways in which he's punished is by sending him on military service. And you can see him circled in this photo on the right. You can see him smiling quite a lot as well. He doesn't necessarily take doing military service as a punishment. Those of you who read French will note that he's captioned this is me with 2 Soviet officers in Batna in the east of Algeria. And of course, for a communist, which he was, hanging around with Soviet officers in Batna is not necessarily a huge punishment. But I want to finish with the story of Mohammed Ben Amour, who you see here. And in 1967, he wasn't a student. He had until very recently been a student. He was Algeria's very first aeronautical engineer, and we can see him, there's a little red cross over his head, graduating from aeronautical engineering school in France in 1962. After independence, the French were still controlling Algerian civilian airspace, as Algerians didn't have the technical expertise to do so themselves. And I really want to underline here, it's not just that the control of airspace, it's mostly French people populating this, but it's actually a French organization, the Organization for the Management of Air Safety, which is controlling it. It's not under Algerian sovereignty. For a while, Mohammed said he'd been thinking about how to bring under Algerian control this part of aviation, but he said no one in a position of power was particularly interested in this until the moment of the Six-Day War. And this is what he says. We had aeroplanes which were meant to take off, taking medicines to help Egypt. These aeroplanes couldn't take off. Why not? Because what usually happens is a pilot sends a flight plan, and at the point of departure, he requests clearance for takeoff from the National Centre for Air Navigation. And it's this centre which gives permission to begin preparation for takeoff. And these planes were heading for Egypt, and they were not clear for takeoff because the French, they knew what the planes were going to do. They were going to help the Egyptians. So they didn't give authorization for takeoff. And then he says, the Minister for Transport was told about it and he was not happy at all. He is a very understated man, because I think probably not happy at all, yeah, maybe underestimates his reaction. And from that point on, Ben Amour is given quite an important role in Algerianizing civil aviation. And we can see the importance that civil aviation suddenly takes on for the Algerian state after this moment. But behind, you know, these sort of important political figures is the work of sort of a young man really in his late 20s. So I'm gonna sort of finish there to allow us some time for questions. But I just wanted to finish on this image. So on the left, we have another image, again produced by the French sort of Atelier Populaire, which sort of is another sort of spirit of 68, this idea that we need to, you know, stop working so hard, stop being sort of, you know, exploited cogs in the capitalist system, down with infernal rhythms. Whereas in the stories I think that you've heard tonight, we've heard a lot about actually how all of these students wanted to be doing lots and lots of things at the same time, and were doing lots and lots of things at the same time as part of what they saw as a collective struggle of decolonization and making that kind of a real thing. And Ahmed Ben Yahya, who, as I mentioned, was a student activist, leaves Algeria, participates in the French May 68, quite quickly comes back to Algeria in the late 1970s and begins creating statues of revolutionary heroes. And on the right is another one of his works of art. And you can see that this is very much being celebrated in the city of Constantine, with this being paraded, surrounded by sort of members of the military. So I will finish there. Thank you very much for listening.
Natalya, a huge thank you. First for reminding us of the complexities and the interconnectedness of that period, and the texture that you gave us in terms of that rich history through the stories. Can I remind everyone, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A chat? We already have a couple, but I'm going to use Chair's privilege, Natalya, and ask you the first question, if I may, because of course there are protests that we're seeing now in, you know, Oxford, across the US and elsewhere. And I wonder if you were talking about a particular historic period, but is there anything that you can see in terms of connectivity between then and now?
I mean, I think, you know, sort of the parallels in many ways are very obvious, even though, you know, as historians, we're always, you know, careful about drawing sort of too sharp a line between past and present. I mean, one of the things that is quite striking is sort of the relationship of university administrations with their students. So, you know, obviously nowadays we don't really have the head of the secret police who is a student and being taught by someone who is significantly younger and definitely less powerful. So those power dynamics have shifted. You know, across the world we tend to have much more hierarchical systems. But I think sort of the idea of what relationship university administrations have with students is a really important one, and what it means when you bring the police in against your student. And this is a very, you know, hot topic and politicized issue in the 1960s, and it has remained so. So in French, they've got a term for this. It's called the franchise universitaire. So it's the idea that the police should never go inside a university without being sort of invited to do so. But the idea that they're not really meant to bring them in to protect free speech and that kind of thing. And whenever that is broken, and it's very regularly broken in this period, that tends to sort of lead to an escalation of the situation. I think the other thing that we can maybe learn, or that's interesting to think about, is about solidarity and how solidarity functions and what it means. So one of the things that I was quite interested in my research is what did all these different figures mean to these people? You know, did people really know who Tushombe was, and why did they have a poster of sort of Che Guevara on their wall? And sometimes, to be honest, a lot of that knowledge is quite superficial, and sometimes it isn't. But I think often what this international solidarity is doing is it does work as a way of trying to effect change in other places, but it's also about sort of shaping you politically back home as well.
Natalya, thank you. I've got a question from, I hope I get the pronunciation right, Martin Newell, who asks, what are your thoughts on forms of protest rather than contents of protest by students at the time? For example, students invented the teach-in as a means of increasing understanding of, say, the Vietnam War. Is there evidence that this form of protest was more productive than the sit-ins, demonstrations, and encampments by student activists?
I mean, I think it's hard to work out sort of what's more productive, because obviously they kind of go hand in hand with each other. So, you know, as part of a sit-in, you would have a teach-in. So I think it would be hard to sort of evaluate which was the most effective or which sort of cut through the most. I mean, one of the things that's quite striking is the way in which a lot of these forms of protest sort of still continue to the present day, even though different content is put into them. And there's also a pattern that you see in the 60s of students sort of learning from each other, and the circulation not only of ideas but of methods as well.
Thank you. Another question, which is about your sources for your talk. Could you tell us about the different sources you consulted and the role of oral histories in all of this?
Yeah, so as you will have been able to tell, this is sort of very much an oral history project that I've been sort of conducting over the last few years. So it's sort of trying to get a grip on this sort of first generation of students that are perhaps best understood as sort of a political age rather than a chronological age, and thinking about sort of their relationship to the state. So I've tried to sort of get as good coverage from sort of a range of topics as possible. So I've done a lot of interviews with law students, but also students in sciences, medical students, and so on and so forth. And then that is sort of complemented with archival work. The challenge being that the archives of post-independence Algeria are actually very difficult to get into, and it's not clear what has been archived and sort of what hasn't been archived. Interestingly, one of the archives that I found very useful for this project is the French Ministry of Education, because even after independence in 1962, they don't necessarily acknowledge that Algeria has become independent. Now, this might sound crazy what I'm saying, but the Foreign Ministry has to keep telling the Ministry of Education off, because they keep trying to nominate heads of university and send teachers to Algeria. So actually, you get quite a lot of post-independence history where you're not expecting to find it. And then finally, the other thing you will have noticed, there's a lot of photos in it. So when I do the interviews, I've been sort of asking interviewees to sort of share their photos with me, and often that creates a really interesting sort of discussion point as well. And you will have noticed there's real stories of sort of social mobility within these stories as well. So often, you know, people are very moved when they're showing you pictures of them obviously living like in a lot of poverty, and how they relate to that, you know, as someone who's university educated and pretty middle class actually today.
That's a really interesting connection, because there's a question not so much about the photographs, but about some of the posters, asking if you found any specific themes in the rhetoric used in the political posters of the period.
Yeah, so the posters there are actually French posters, and the very particular sort of distinctive style are the sort of the French students at the art school. So the key themes in there are sort of really against de Gaulle. They don't like de Gaulle very much at all. Against the fact that there's a lot of state control of the media. But there's also ones that are much more sort of utopian, like "forbidden to forbid" is a very famous slogan that was also produced on a poster. Or "underneath the paving stones is the beach," and things like that. And then there's things that are sort of, you know, in favour of workers' rights, anti-imperialist, and so on and so forth. It's very difficult to get a sense of how that visual culture sort of played out in Algeria, primarily because these students are really operating in clandestine conditions. So the documents that I've been able to show, they're really sort of the exception rather than the rule, because obviously people weren't holding onto these things. It would be actually quite difficult to keep hold of them. So it's more, you know, what is in the archive about records of graffiti, what are the slogans that they're using, but that they're much harder to get a grasp of because there's sort of less visual trace.
And can I, we've got a couple of other questions which I'll come to in a moment, but can I also ask a question which goes back to your title in a way, and this issue of sort of activism and protest and being part of the state? To what extent did these young people who had these jobs bring a more radical policy perspective into the state and state building at that time?
That's a brilliant question. So what is particularly striking about the 1960s is this moment of both contestation, but also there's things that the Algerian state does that actually left-wing students really quite like, in terms of, you know, the way in which it sort of takes an anti-imperial position in the world, you know, its support for other anti-colonial movements such as those in Angola, the fact that, you know, it's inviting the Black Panthers there and Nelson Mandela, you know, all of those things that I actually really sort of quite agree with. And in terms of economic policy, they've actually got quite a lot in common. But it's really striking that it's in 1971 where the Algerian Students' Union is actually ultimately dissolved by the Algerian state. It no longer exists. It no longer exists, and there's no longer an autonomous student movement. But also at that moment is when the Algerian state first nationalizes petrol, very popular measure amongst left-wing students, and secondly creates sort of a big agrarian reform scheme and encourages students to sign up to what's called the volontariat, so to be volunteers, to go and explain the benefits of this measure to students. And then a lot of them enter what they call, they're kind of like sort of critical friends, so they dislike the authoritarianism, but actually they really like, and no doubt have really influenced some of sort of the more radical economic policy.
Really interesting. So another question, what's been the impact of the events that you described on the outlook of French Algerian students subsequently?
As in that particular generation?
I think as in that generation, but also if you look at the history, has that history had a kind of, has it had a different impact on those who came after?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question if you understand it in both ways. So firstly, in terms of this history, it is a history which is really largely unknown in Algeria. And the reason for that is because there's very little history that is done after independence. There's a lot of sort of celebration of the anti-colonial struggle, but actually in many ways history sort of ends in 1962, because that's, you know, when there starts to be internal disputes, it becomes more difficult to talk about. So there's no sort of public recognition really of sort of post-independence history. So a lot of this is actually forgotten in many ways. And what was quite interesting is some of the oral histories I've sort of, you know, they were filmed and they were put on YouTube in an attempt to sort of try and generate a conversation. And it's really interesting because, you know, some people are thinking, oh, this is interesting to think about the 1960s in Algeria. But some of them are responding, oh, I remember Mrs. Belanto, she gave me a really bad mark in geology in year 2. So it's interesting to think about how you try and get a conversation going about a period of history that hasn't been studied. In terms of sort of themselves, I think one of the issues that this generation faces is they acquire positions of influence and significance very young in their life, and then they found it very hard to let go of that.
Yeah.
So and that's not just a problem sort of particular to Algeria, but there is a bit of a narrative that we can't pass over, you know, what we built to the next generation because they're not ready for it, and there is a bit of generational tension there.
Yeah. So we're out of time, but I'm going to ask you to answer a sort of last question in two parts as quickly as you can, if I may. Um, at the end of your talk, you really talk specifically about the experience of women. And I wondered if you could say something about the distinctiveness of that in terms of contribution and so on. And I think this next part you've kind of already answered, but one of our attendees basically says, you know, that they're an old fogey from the 60s and that students have always been revolting. And I don't mean revolting, but been part of revolutions. A natural reaction for being emancipated from school. So what's different now? I think you've already talked a bit about what's different now, but if we could close off on those two things, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. So if I sort of start with the question on women. So a really great question, because women in Algeria have already played quite an important role in the independence struggle, and kind of as a result of that to a certain extent has broken down a certain degree of conservatism about sort of the place of women in sort of the public sphere. They are even more likely to be illiterate than men. So upon independence, 90% of men are illiterate, 95% of women. But because there's such a shortage of qualified personnel, this actually opens up quite a big degree of opportunity for women in the workplace that is not necessarily present in, you know, Western Europe, where there's plenty of men to fill those roles. So one statistic I always like to give, that actually Algeria has more female deputies in its National Assembly in 1962 than Britain does. So there is a great deal of opportunity for women who have had sort of access to education. And I think the story of Warda Balanta is kind of telling about the fact that she sort of encounters hostility to her going abroad. They're very, you know, worried about what might happen to her. And at the same time, they let her do it anyway. And she also, you know, the end of that story is that she's very worried about her family's reaction to the fact that, you know, she's going to be sent, that she's going to study abroad. So she actually lies to them, and she tells them that she's being sent by work on a training course. And then she has to keep lying. And every year she said, I failed the training course, have to go back again. And, you know, by year 4, they're getting quite suspicious of this. But eventually they come around to the idea. It helps, of course, that her dad is a communist. And so she organises him to go to a trip to Lenin's mausoleum, which he famously once told her that he'd rather go to than go to Mecca. So, you know, I think there is a lot of sort of social conservatism around this, but actually the fact that there's a shortage of people that have had access to any level of education does open up and sort of create windows of opportunity for women. But it's important to underline that their experiences are not the same. So, you know, the student volunteering in the countryside, if you talk to men who participate in that, they're like, oh, it was great. There were lots of women and men. It was very mixed. We all got on well. And some women will tell you the same thing. Other women will tell you a different story. And some women, it was so unimaginable that they would ever do that. They would say women weren't allowed to do it when they were. So it's a really important question to sort of think about. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there is a sort of a generational thing that, you know, every generation sort of wants to react against sort of the previous generation. But I guess sort of what I was kind of trying to underline in the talk is that this is much more than a generational revolt, that actually what this is, it is the story of decolonization. And so what we have is we know how anti-colonial leaders have done that through achieving political independence, but actually, you know, that's kind of only just the beginning. What do we do? What are we doing now? What is the kind of society that we're building? And actually, the ages in terms of chronological age, they're very sort of mixed up. So it's actually quite difficult to distinguish between different generations and age term in this period. And I think that ultimately this probably is much more a story about decolonization than it is a story about students. So I probably, you know, I lied to you when I gave the title of
Natalya, a huge thank you. I learned a lot, and I hope that everyone who joined our webinar did too. So thank you for your time, and a huge thank you to all of you for joining us. And we really look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.